Yes. Well, to me, the unique aspect of ESE research is that it is research that is emancipatory, and that research has a pedagogical end in and by itself. And that basically means that um, a move away from what I would call extractivist research, where we kind of extract data from schools, from communities, from young people, from anyone, maybe with the aim to write policy briefs or to write recommendations, but where we in a way take advantage of people as a source of information, just like the mine is a source of metals and minerals, and then we leave the mine kind of abandoned and we move on to the next school or the next community. That type of extractivist research leaves people without benefiting from the research very much. And I think environmental and sustainability oriented research also has an innate responsibility to contribute to the well-being of people and planet. So that has methodological consequences. So this idea also of reducing people into smaller units that can be studied as variables that can be quantified and measured, and look for correlations, causalities, and help us kind of maximize predictability about what might happen if we design something in this way, and minimizes uncertainty in a way, as a goal of empirical analytical positivistic science does not align very well with the philosophy, the underlying values and ethics of environmental and sustainability education. Now, I realize that not everyone in the field will look at it in that way, but if you ask me what is my personal position in relation to this, then I very much connect with this idea, not so much as research as mining, but rather research as learning or as co-learning, and maybe even research as activism, where we feel that we need to be sympathetic to those who are being marginalized. That could be other humans, or it could be people, living far away, or people living under difficult circumstances, but it could also be other species. And then in that alignment, we become also activists. So research as activism is something that I think is controversial in the world of science, maybe, but given the urgency of the current sustainability crises, and given that the trajectory that much of science has put us on, and unwillingly education as well, we now are at a turning point where we need to rethink and recalibrate our moral compass in our research. So I do feel that ESE research should be at the forefront of this more emancipatory, activist-oriented research, where we come to know the reality that challenges people in their everyday lives with the people for as much as possible, but where we also try to kind of put ourselves in the minds of other species. This sounds very difficult. This is a post-humanist perspective that is not very well articulated yet, but I think that's where we might be heading in the future. Yeah, so my own position, historically, you can go back to, I was very lucky when I was a PhD student. My chair was Bill Stepp, and he was seen in North America as the founding father of environmental education. He started the Journal of Environmental Education in 1969. And Bill Stepp was a pragmatist who was very much action-oriented. He always worked with school children, mainly school children in primary and secondary schools, in trying to get them actively involved in bringing about change in the local environment. And so this idea of, and he used action research as a kind of a research methodology, where he involved teachers in also reflecting on their practices and how they could improve their practices within environmental education. And I was kind of became part of a tradition of what we called at the University of Michigan at the time action research and community problem solving. At the time, you had in environmental education a very much behavior-oriented approach to environmental education, which started in the early 70s, where education was seen as an instrument to change environmental behavior, or to get people to love nature or to connect with nature as a tool, so to speak. And much of the research was of the empirical analytical kind. How do we know this is working? What's the evidence? So it's very much evidence-based. And that type of research was also published in the Journal of Environmental Education. It was the flavor of the day, so to speak. And it took a long time for that to change. It was not until the late 1980s that different voices in the field of environmental education research were becoming louder, and this research, this more interpretive, hermeneutical type of co-learning tradition and phenomenology entered the field, and also the more action-oriented, activism-oriented approaches entered the field. And more journals appeared that were more open to these voices. And I'm thinking of the Australian Journal of Environmental Education, but also of Environmental Education Research, Canadian Journal of Environmental Education, and journals like Local Environment. These were journals that were much more grounded in empowering people, in engaging people meaningfully, in figuring out how their lives are being affected by the changing environment, but also the other way around, how the changing environment is affecting people's lives. Also looking at local global connections, which became more important as we entered the 1990s, with also the UNCED World Conference on Environment and Development in Rio de Janeiro in '92, as kind of a moment where it was not just about changing environmental behavior or ecological literacy, which still maybe was important, but we then also saw more attention to marginalization, decolonization, other species, the non-human world, decentering of the human. Those kinds of movements started affecting and influencing environmental education as well. And you see in the ESER community, in the network 30, where there's a kind of convergence between environmental and sustainability education. It's the only place, I think, in the world where we talk about ESE, which says something about how this convergence is important, and in some ways prevents this dichotomy between environment and sustainability. I've always been a little bit concerned about this instrumentality. I've done a lot of work together with Bob Jickling over the years, and Bob Jickling already in 1991 wrote a paper, Why I Don't Want My Children to Be Educated for Sustainable Development. He found it highly problematic, and when I talk about landmark publications, that certainly would be one of them. And therefore, I see myself more grounded in kind of building traditions, focusing more on empowering people and finding voice, agency, and finding methodologies that speak to that and open up pathways for deeper understanding, more meaningful engagement, for developing relationships through research. And that, I think, is also where we find a lot of young scholars at the moment who are more in tune with that approach, I think, now than maybe 10, 20 years ago. Well, first, let me kind of critique or trouble this notion of European, because it's hard to kind of categorize the research as European. For one, Europe in itself is a very diverse place with big differences even within countries. But if you look at research traditions, you will also find differences between, say, the North and the South in environmental education. Generally, but again, this is also stereotyping maybe. In the south of Europe, there was far more attention for subjects like geography, humanities, and arts in environmental education. And in the north, it was far more focusing on nature, forest, and ecology. And you could also find this amplified in the kind of programs developed, but also in the research. There was the kinds of research questions that were asked. Another point I want to make is that if you look historically at publications, most of them, the founding fathers, and there the word already says it, fathers, they tended to be white males. And Annette Goff from Australia, she did once a study on the founding fathers of environmental education, and indeed they are from the West, North America, Europe. Maybe even more North America, but also from Australia, from Oceania, you know, from the former colonies of the UK, you could say. So it's a very colonial air around this history, which is somewhat troubling. And now that we are beginning to come to terms with that, we are also needing to kind of revisit that history and see what did we leave out, what's been missing in those histories. So when you ask me what are key publications, I cannot really call them European. I mentioned Bob Jickling's Why I Don't Want My Children to Be Educated for Sustainable Development. He's Canadian, but also with Scottish roots. Bob Jickling has a Scottish connection. So there's that connection with Europe, you could say. But there's also, and this is also true for many of the American people I worked with when I was studying, they also had European roots. One key publication comes from that Journal of Environmental Education that was already started in 1969. And that was related to the action, research, and community problem-solving approach we developed there. And it was done also with a German colleague, Almut Behringer. So it was somebody from Holland and Germany together with Bill Stepp writing this paper on how inner city Detroit children were using the local environment and their own life world as starting points for learning about the local environment. That's that type of work, which also connected with environmental education for empowerment, which was kind of the booklet that followed from that. I think are still key publications for those who want to have a more localized curriculum where young people can develop agency and can act. Another historic publication that is European, also no, it's Euro-Canadian, you could say. It's this one. It's Earth Rights, which is a really foundational booklet on how different educations that were in the 1980s competing in a way with each other: human rights education, development education, environmental education, and health education. And they show how they are connected and related, and that we need not see them as opposites or as competing with each other, but that they in their essence are at the core about how we live more lightly, more equitably, more healthily on this planet. So this by Greg Pike and David Selby and Sue Gregg is also really important. I think this is late 80s already. And then when you go to the early, say, 90s, you know, we got the seminars that started in Denmark with our Danish colleagues on action competence, and the book from 1994 that came out of the first seminar, Action and Action Competence as Key Concepts in Critical Pedagogy, edited by Bjarne Brun Jensen, who came from the health education side, and Karsten Schnack, who came more from the environmental education side, is, I think, a key publication because it talks about action competence as kind of an emergent property of relations that we establish with each other that invite action. It wasn't defined as some kind of skill or something that you could train or teach. You needed to create spaces that would allow these capacities to unfold, which is a very innovative view away from the behavioral change models that were so dominant at that time. That was repeated another time. This is another one that came out of that same kind of community a few years later, critical environmental and health education, also by Bjarne Bjørn Jensen and Karsten Snack, but then also Venka Simovka joined as one of the editors. Another, I think, key publication that really is one of the first books on the whole school approach is from Tony Shellcross and John Robinson, that came out of a European project at the time. And this booklet is from 2004, I believe. Creating Sustainable Environments in Our Schools is beginning to recognize that you cannot add on environmental education or sustainability education as kind of a project or a module or as a way or as an environmental care system where we separate waste. No, it must be part of the DNA of the whole school. It must be a systemic part of the system. It requires a new ethos, a different culture, a new leadership, but also a different look at curriculum and how we connect with the local community, how we make the school a kind of a living lab. It's an early use of living lab, you might say, where we can experiment with fairness, with diversity, with water, with biodiversity, and so on, and learn from it. And maybe as a last one, one major project that the AERA supported at the time, the American Educational Research Project, was they had these research handbooks, and I was, lucky to work with Bob Stevenson, an Australian who at the time lived in Buffalo, New York, and worked there, and is now back in Australia, and Justin Dillon, who's from the United Kingdom, and Michael Brody, who's from the US, and then me from the Netherlands, worked on this kind of major book that brings together lots of research that at the time was seen as key contributions to environmental education research in this major handbook, which is already 10 years old or so. And I still think that this is one of the few kind of handbooks that kind of captures these different traditions, but also provides, kind of sketches the whole landscape of environmental education research at the time. And it's shifted since, because the post-human perspectives are coming in now more, and we also have more critical perspectives. And I think we also have more, the idea of research as activism now is much stronger than it was when we did this handbook. So those would be some publications that I personally have been connected to as well. There's of course many others that I'm not connected to that are also very meaningful and important. So I don't want to dismiss those. But these are, for me, they were critical. And perhaps one more that I also, that from a personal point of view, that I think made a lot of impact was the book we did on social learning for sustainability, which was one of the early books looking at multi-stakeholder social learning. How can we utilize diversity better? How can we have more dialogical approaches to environmental and social and ecological, cultural, social, economical sustainability, all of that.